Imagine this for a second. You walk into your first day at Harvard or Yale in the 1950s, nervous about classes, only to be told to strip naked for a photo session. Sounds like a bad dream, right? But from the late 1800s into the 1970s, elite universities actually took nude body photos of their students. Administrators claimed these images were about posture and health, but in 1940, psychologist William Sheldon saw something more. He turned them into raw material for his theory that body shape could reveal personality, a claim that would ripple through science and culture. We'll explore how this began, starting with the strange health obsession behind posture photos themselves. The strange origins of posture photos. Why did some of the most prestigious colleges in the country decide that photographing students without clothes was the key to keeping them healthy? At first it sounds absurd, but at the turn of the 20th century, posture was treated as a serious public health concern. Doctors and educators believed slouching or poor spinal alignment could lead to everything from back pain to decreased stamina. In the context of the First World War and later conflicts, worries about military readiness also fed into this fixation. If young men had weak posture, the reasoning went, they might not pass muster for national service. Against that backdrop, schools began presenting posture examinations as a modern, science-based safeguard. Medical knowledge at the time often leaned on visible external measurements to make sweeping claims about health. Many physicians thought that the way someone stood, walked, or carried themselves could act as an early warning sign of more serious conditions. Universities, eager to project themselves as leaders in scientific thinking, found posture photography appealing. The process looked clinical, the equipment felt modern, and the records fit neatly into a belief that health could be managed by careful observation. For administrators, these photos weren't just about fixing a student's slouch. They represented a vision of producing graduates who looked as polished and disciplined as they were educated. Harvard was among the earliest adopters of these posture programs. By the early 20th century, posture examinations had become part of student health checks at the university. Over the following decades, similar programs spread across Ivy League campuses, and by the 1940s through the 1970s, they appeared at women's colleges such as the Seven Sisters schools as well. Once one institution implemented the practice, others quickly followed. No school wanted to look old-fashioned when it came to student health. The result was a system in which large cohorts of incoming freshmen were photographed and catalogued year after year. The process itself was standardized. Students were brought into controlled environments, often assigned identical poses, and lined up so photographs could capture their posture from consistent angles. These weren't personal keepsakes. They were medical records stored by the institution, often disappearing into archives where clinicians and educators could review them. The scale of this effort meant that storage rooms filled steadily with images, creating vast collections of visual data on young adults who never thought much beyond the immediate oddness of posing. Most students complied without protest, largely because refusing never felt like a real option. Universities at this time carried immense authority in students' lives. If a dean or physician explained that posture photos were essential for health monitoring, that was justification enough. Consent was not formally requested, and questions of privacy rarely surfaced, not when the practice was framed as scientific record-keeping for one's own benefit. For new students eager to belong, there was little thought given to challenging the request. Looking back now, the serious tone surrounding these assessments stands in sharp contrast to how we might perceive them. Administrators and doctors approached the photos as hard data, tools meant to classify and correct bodily alignment. Yet to a modern eye, the rituals echo something more intrusive. Young people, nervous and unclothed, asked to expose themselves under the authority of their institution. The fact that programs existed for decades highlights not only the breadth of the practice, but also how easily it blended into campus tradition. Once the habit had taken root, it seemed ordinary. Freshman orientation included health checks included posture evaluations included the photo. And because universities presented the process as routine, its invasive nature slipped largely unnoticed. Institutions justified year after year of collections in the language of care, discipline, and educational duty. The posture programs became entrenched, an annual ritual that reinforced the idea that surveillance of the body was a form of scientific progress. Over time, the body of material preserved in these archives grew to enormous proportions. What began as narrow health monitoring had produced a photographic record of thousands of students, spanning multiple generations. The data no longer amounted to individual health snapshots, but functioned as a massive, unpublished visual catalogue of physical variation. In hindsight, the very existence of such an archive carried risks. Once stored under the control of universities, these images could be opened to new interpretations far beyond posture correction. That's the hinge in this story. Posture photos made sense only as long as they served the narrow definition of medical records, but bound in files across elite universities, they became tempting for others to reinterpret, not as evidence of spinal curvature, but as something far larger. And they soon would be. Those files didn't remain medical records for long. One psychologist turned them into a different kind of science. William Sheldon enters the picture. The figure who brought this new direction into focus was William Herbert Sheldon. Trained first as a medical doctor and later as a psychologist, Sheldon was ambitious, credentialed, and convinced that the human body held hidden clues to character. In the 1940s, he started publishing major works on body types, culminating in 1954 with the Atlas of Men**. These books gave his theories scientific shape, and they were built on a premise that captured both academic and public imagination. Physical form, he argued, was tied directly to personality. For Sheldon, the nude posture photographs archived at universities were not inconsequential medical files at all. They were raw data, tens of thousands of standardized images that could be sorted, scored, and aligned into a grand system linking body to mind. Sheldon came of age in the early 20th century, during a period when eugenic ideas were embedded in mainstream science. Concepts like measuring skulls, charting body proportions, or equating physical traits with intelligence and morality were regularly taught in universities. Although criticism of eugenics grew after the Second World War, Sheldon clung to a belief that biology could be mapped into categories as neatly as chemical elements. He wasn't satisfied with general impressions. He aimed to build a comprehensive catalogue that promised predictive power. In his mind, a person's build was more than appearance. It was an index of temperament, ambition, and even moral fiber. This approach became what he called constitutional psychology. Its central claim was bold in its simplicity. Body type revealed temperament. The width of a chest, the curve of the belly, the length of arms and legs were not just attributes but indicators of personality. Every individual, he argued, could be placed into a framework that forecast emotional makeup and behavioral style. In the 1940s and 1950s, such a system seemed compelling. It turned the uncertainty of human character into something visible, measurable, and supposedly objective. For audiences eager for clarity in the aftermath of global conflict and social upheaval, Sheldon's tidy categories promised answers delivered by science. The cultural timing mattered. War, depression, and upheaval had left societies eager for reliable ways to classify and predict behavior. Psychology as a discipline still struggled for the prestige enjoyed by medicine or physics. A theory that insisted body shape correlated with character seemed like progress, an advance that replaced guesswork with observation and numbers. Sheldon's confidence in his system made it sound less like speculation and more like discovery. When he spoke or wrote, it was with the authority of someone uncovering natural law. His somatotype charts and measurement systems came across as orderly, modern, and persuasive to both students and professionals. At the center of his system were the somatotypes, three body categories tied to embryological development. Endomorphs were rounded, heavier, associated by Sheldon with sociability and comfort-seeking. Mesomorphs were muscular, broad, linked in his theory to aggression and assertiveness. Ectomorphs were thinner, narrow, connected to sensitivity and introversion. Though he emphasized that most people could be described as blends scored along scales, the appeal lay in how quickly the categories converted flesh into forecast. By calculating ratios, Sheldon claimed he could define a person's balance of traits, a system that made identity seem like a number waiting to be uncovered. But theories require evidence, and Sheldon needed material on a vast scale. Posture photographs collected under the guise of medical assessment provided exactly that. Standardized poses, consistent lighting, unadorned bodies. These images gave Sheldon a dataset unlike any other. He eventually gained access to photographs from multiple institutions, sometimes through correspondence, sometimes through collaborations or archival agreements. Letters between him and schools like Vassar document how this access was negotiated. The result was an archive of tens of thousands of nude student photographs, appropriated into research projects far beyond the students' knowledge or consent. For the young adults photographed, the situation was starkly different. They believed their images were taken to assess back curvature or physical fitness, records tucked away in health files. Consent was never obtained for psychological study, let alone for reclassification into categories of personality. By today's standards, the intrusion is obvious, but even at the time, the leap from posture evaluation to personality mapping was far outside what any student had been told. Universities that permitted Sheldon access to their archives blurred the line between health surveillance and research exploitation, turning a medical procedure into fuel for a controversial psychology. Sheldon promoted his work with conviction. In publications and lectures, he presented his somatotypes as discoveries backed by massive datasets. He implied that his findings could guide everything from education to hiring, even predicting leadership qualities or criminal susceptibility. To administrators and funders looking for clear systems to evaluate human potential, this certainty was tempting. Suddenly, anonymous undergraduates photographed in their first semester were reimagined as evidence for laws of character. Journalists spread the catchy framework, and magazines explained how body outlines revealed inner truth. Constitutional psychology gained traction, not only in academic circles but in popular culture, where it seemed an easy shortcut to knowing someone at a glance. When viewed today, the claims feel both simplistic and invasive. The suggestion that abdominal shape dictated temperament, or that muscularity explained dominance, reduces individuality to caricature. Imagine a job interview where your shoulders are silently being read as signs of aggression, or a social encounter where someone assumes your appetite is evident in your waistline. The humor in picturing such jumps highlights the absurdity, but it cannot soften the ethical breach at the system's core. Real students under authority were turned into unwitting subjects in a classification scheme that stripped privacy and reshaped identity. Sheldon's ambitions stretched even further with his atlases. These large volumes, organized with photos and scales, sought to present definitive references on the human form and its supposed psychological correlates. In 1954, the Atlas of Men put his theory into print, displaying nude male photographs as exemplars of somatotypes. He hoped to create similar collections for women. The indexing looked scientific, images laid side by side, measured, numbered, but it carried echoes of older racial and eugenic catalogues, where bodies had been arrayed to prove hierarchy. Sheldon may have thought of himself as modernizing psychology, but his method reinscribed old judgments in statistical clothing. The ethical problems were amplified by scale. Tens of thousands of students, images were pulled into a vision they had never endorsed. The imbalance was sharp. Respected institutions opened collections to a determined psychologist, while young people, many barely out of adolescence, were silent participants, their trust in their universities misplaced. What had been presented as posture correction quietly morphed into a foundation for sweeping claims about morality, criminality, and achievement. Sheldon's personal style reinforced the problem. Critics existed, but his certainty and his piles of evidence gave him cover. With precise charts, mathematical scales, and confident language, he brushed aside objections. To many, the sheer weight of his images suggested scientific justification. It made questioning him harder in an era when psychology was trying to prove itself as rigorous and quantitative. Somatotypes seemed like a clean science of human nature, valid enough for classrooms and textbooks. Yet the consequences went beyond faulty categories. The system erased individuality, making students into specimens. It ignored culture, environment, choice, factors essential to personality. It disregarded privacy entirely, treating bodies captured under one purpose as material for another. What began in gyms and infirmaries as health records had been redirected into books that made sweeping declarations about human potential. The reach of constitutional psychology lay not in its scientific foundation, but in its appeal. The suggestion that who you are could be known instantly by how you looked. That appeal ensured influence beyond academia. Magazines turned somatotypes into digestible charts for everyday readers. Employers and educators were drawn to its clear judgments, and even law enforcement entertained the idea that criminality might be forecast in the body. By the time tens of thousands of photographs had been poured into Sheldon's system, the lines between science and stereotype were blurred. And the unsettling part is how easily it happened, not through coercion of students, but through routine medical practices redirected by a confident theorist. The question that lingers, then, is not only about what Sheldon believed, but how his framework gained traction. Why did simplified categories of endomorph, mesomorph, and ectomorph seem so persuasive to so many? How did these nude clinical photos become the raw material for a scheme that claimed bodies equal minds? The seductive simplicity of somatotypes. The reason Sheldon's system spread so quickly had less to do with solid science and more to do with its deceptive neatness. It offered a world where personality could be sketched out simply by looking at the body. To a public craving shortcuts, that was a compelling promise. Instead of facing the ambiguity of psychological testing or individual complexity, someone could supposedly grasp a person's temperament at a glance. Sheldon called these broad divisions somatotypes, and he described 3 of them with terms that sounded clinical but were easy to picture. Endomorphs were rounder and softer, Mesomorphs muscular and broad, Ectomorphs narrow and lean. Alongside those physical sketches, Sheldon tied corresponding psychological scripts. The endomorph was imagined as sociable and relaxed, the mesomorph as confident and dominant, the ectomorph as sensitive and withdrawn. In one stroke, shapes of flesh became shapes of character. What made the system appear distinctive was the addition of numbers. Sheldon insisted people were rarely pure examples of one type, so he created a 3-number scale ranging from 1 to 7 for each category: endomorph, mesomorph, ectomorph. A person could be coded as, say, 462, supposedly representing a mix tilted toward muscularity. On the surface, this looked precise, almost mathematical, but in practice, these scores were not derived from exact measurements. They were largely visual judgments made by raters comparing body images, leaving the process subjective and inconsistent. By dressing guesswork in numerical clothing, Sheldon gave the impression of scientific accuracy without the rigor to support it. This scoring system turned his charts and photographs into what seemed like a structured database. People are inclined to trust numbers, and seeing combinations like 354 or 712 made the theory feel quantifiable. It offered the aura of objectivity, while masking the fact that the underlying evaluations were based on personal interpretation. To readers in the 1940s and 1950s, the idea of reducing personality to a numerical code carried modern appeal. Psychological complexity could be made legible in the same way as a medical test or statistical survey. The simplicity was seductive because it converted something intangible into a visible, trackable system. Part of the attraction lay in how familiar this kind of classification felt. People have long embraced tools that promise to decode personality through easy categories. Just as horoscopes link star signs to human traits, somatotypes boiled life experience down to body outline. Just as modern personality tests online sort people into broad types with a handful of questions, Sheldon's model asked only that you look in a mirror. The cultural climate of the mid-20th century, marked by industrial change and unease after world wars, only amplified the appetite for certainty. In periods of disorder, a framework that organizes people into 3 clear groups with coded scores has obvious appeal. The media extended his reach far beyond academic circles. Lifestyle magazines ran spreads framed almost like entertainment, suggesting body shape could reveal patterns in dating or professional promise. Articles carried lines about how readers might discover hidden truths in the projection of their shoulders or waist. Even though serious psychologists debated the validity of such claims, the neatness of Sheldon's divisions made them easy to present to general audiences. Readers didn't need scientific training to participate. They simply matched themselves to the descriptions, attaching personality to physique without questioning the premise. This accessibility was also what made it so problematic. Each category carried judgments shaped by cultural biases of the time. Endomorphs, often heavier, were portrayed as more indulgent or lacking discipline, signals of a society that prized thinness as moral control. Mesomorphs, celebrated for their musculature, were cast as decisive leaders, reflecting traditional admiration for physical strength. Ectomorphs, presented as frail and nervous, echoed stereotypes of intellectuals as disconnected and overly sensitive. What looked like scientific discovery was, in reality, a mirror of social attitudes given academic framing. The labels reinforced old stereotypes under the guise of new insight. When taken to extremes, the absurdity becomes clear. Imagine being told your tendency to succeed at work was best demonstrated by your shoulder width, or that your capacity for empathy could be read from your abdomen. These leaps exposed the flaws, yet at the time, they were respected in more than casual settings. To laugh at them today is to miss that real opportunities were affected. Students, job applicants, and recruits were judged by frameworks that owed more to cultural storytelling than empirical study. The fingerprints of this desire for simplification still exist. In modern culture, personality shorthand continues to attract attention, whether in phone apps that map birth charts, personality type quizzes shared on social media, or love language assessments that circulate as guides for relationships. Few of these pass serious scientific scrutiny, yet they remain popular because they give complex realities a sense of order. Sheldon's somatotypes were an early scientific-sounding ancestor of this phenomenon. The main difference was that his categories were reinforced not just by magazines or entertainment, but also by the credibility of academic institutions. This institutional embrace gave the system a weight far beyond novelty. Universities, researchers, and sometimes government programs acknowledged the categories in ways that signaled they were more than opinion. When a framework moves from private amusement to official application, it shapes real environments. Hiring committees, military selectors, or teachers could easily allow stereotypes about body type to tint their evaluations, often without realizing how much bias was imported from Sheldon's publications. Instead of harmless curiosity, the system became another route for discrimination. The durability of those stereotypes is visible in the cultural characters that persist: the athletic leader, the nervous thinker, the carefree but unserious heavier friend. These images did not arise by accident. Somatotype theory gave them a vocabulary and handed them academic weight. Once printed in textbooks and medical atlases, they became harder to dismiss. Decades later, even after the theories were discredited, the appeal of these character sketches stuck in public imagination. Cultural habits often outlast the science that inspired them. The elegance of the structure, 3 types, 3 number codes, simple correlations, was what allowed these ideas to spread so widely. It made the categories feel like a scientific discovery rather than a cultural opinion. But the same features that made the system tidy also masked its emptiness. Reducing all personality to a few body types did not reveal hidden lore. It offered little more than stereotypes in numerical disguise. This contradiction, clear, confident claims masking weak evidence, was at the heart of what made somatotypes simultaneously attractive and dangerous. That danger lay particularly in how the system crossed from personal fascination into formal environments. Once attached to the prestige of science, somatotyping became more than a conversation piece. It guided judgments and justified assumptions, even when the evidence was thin. And it gained that position not simply because Sheldon was persuasive, but because institutions opened their doors and granted his approach legitimacy. Understanding how that happened requires looking at the role of universities themselves in advancing his framework, and the choices they made when granting access to their students, most private records. When pseudoscience hijacks institutions, how could universities, places trusted to teach, protect, and guide, become the enablers of one man's dubious psychological crusade? The answer lies in how easily authority lends credibility, even when it is misplaced. What began as health files stored in gym basements or campus clinics became something very different once William Sheldon came calling. He offered administrators the language of scientific innovation. Archived letters show that some colleges cooperated directly with him, arranging access to posture photographs, sometimes without any attempt to secure student consent. With that approval, Sheldon gained a treasure trove of material no independent researcher could have assembled on his own. A procedure designed to correct posture slippage was quietly rebranded into data for mapping personality. The scale of participation makes the story even more startling. This wasn't a side project surveying a handful of students, it was an industrial pipeline. Every fall, a new cohort of undergraduates walked through health offices and lined up against backdrops. By mid-century, schools had created vast archives, tens of thousands of nude photographs stored in cabinets and film reels. For Sheldon's team, this represented a near census of young, educated Americans, organized with mechanical efficiency. Each freshman filing in for posture checks unwittingly supplied another entry for a database they never knew existed. No signature lines, no warnings, no opportunity to refuse. What looked routine was in fact silent participation in a form of research they would only recognize decades later. Consent, or the absence of it, is the sharpest point of failure. Even allowing for looser norms of the mid-20th century, students had no reason to imagine their bodies were being drafted into psychology. They trusted that the exercise was medical routine, a box ticked before starting classes. Administrators knew better, or at least had reason to pause, but they deferred instead. Sheldon was persuasive, carried prestigious credentials, and spoke the language of science in a way that reassured campus leaders they were backing progress. The students, reliant on the authority figures who governed their education, had no leverage to resist. That power imbalance turned health photographs into research subjects without acknowledgement, an appropriation masked by the silence of official paperwork. What gave the arrangement an even harder edge was the cloak of institutional prestige. To outsiders, the fact that Ivy League and 7 sister schools were associated with the research added instant legitimacy. Families, fellow academics, and funders assumed that any project passing through those gates must be tightly monitored. In reality, there was little oversight at all. Sheldon's theories carried forward under the weight of university reputations, not under the weight of evidence. Undergraduates, too intimidated to challenge procedures, simply followed instructions. Faculty who might have objected refrained, either because the process seemed minor or because rejecting a science-based initiative risked appearing reactionary. In this way, elite brand names silenced the skepticism that might have stopped the project in its tracks. To illustrate the absurdity, imagine Sheldon as curator of the strangest archive in America.